Appreciate the opportunity to talk to some folks nearby. My name's Tom Auer. I've been at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology for about 9 years now. I'm lead geospatial data scientist. I have a background in biology, but a master's degree in geography, geographic information science, which is how I got my start in data. But I've been doing things like what I'm going to talk about tonight for quite a while. I do want to give a shout out that the lab is often hiring technical staff, and we often have trouble finding people in person. So please check out the jobs page at the Lab of Ornithology. We have often a number of technical positions open there, so I hope you'll share those in your communities as well. I'm going to talk about eBird status and trends today, which is a project that takes community science data and analyzes that to generate actionable data products for conservation. I also want to shout out to all the co-authors here. This is really a team effort. We've got a great group of folks who make both eBird, the birding tool, possible, but also the analysis of the data and then putting that data out in the world to have action for birds. So with that, I'm going to jump in. I'm not going to talk about why birds are awesome today because I don't quite have time for that, and I want to focus on data science as much as I can. But I do want to just give a brief intro on eBird since folks might not know what eBird is. It's a project that collects data that are used to estimate the distribution, abundance, and trends of bird populations by collaborating with a global network of bird enthusiasts. So the basic concept here is that birders are really passionate people who like to go out and observe birds, and birds are really great indicators of the environment. And so if we can collect that data, we can use it to help birds, the environment, and people. eBird has been around for over 20 years now and has over 1.8 billion bird observations, making it one of the largest biodiversity data sets in the world. You can see on this map here a heat map of locations, unique locations that we have data from. And the project started, here in New York and the Eastern US, and so we have a lot of data from there. But we're really growing and expanding, especially in Europe and India, Australia, South America, but have work to do, of course, in places where there's less technical infrastructure and less time for birding, like Africa and Russia. But eBird has data from over 18 million locations, every country in the world. There are about 11,200 species of birds recognized now, and we have data for almost 11,000 of those. Over 1 million unique individuals have submitted data, and we have about 250, maybe 300 peer-reviewed publications where people are using eBird data every 5 years or so. So what data do we collect with eBird? And this is kind of the fundamental pieces of our analysis puzzle here is we have mobile apps on both iOS and Android, and we use this concept of a checklist or a list of birds. And on the apps, you start a checklist when you go out for a birding adventure. And these apps now keep a track of the location if you allow it, which you can see here in the bottom left, which gives us really detailed spatial information about where you went, which is important for understanding the habitats of birds. But we collect basic information, date, location, and then we want a list of birds with the counts, not just whether, you saw a bird or not, but how many of them did you see, because that's important for understanding how many birds there are in the world. We also collect information about how you went birding. So were you traveling? Were you stationary? What time did you start? How long were you out? How far did you go? The track on the app now does that automatically. And then how many people were you out with? Because it makes a difference if you're by yourself or you're with a group. And then the key kind of last piece is what we call a complete list of birds. And this is something that distinguishes eBird from other biodiversity collection in that we're asking people to tell us whether or not they are reporting all of the birds that they have seen or not when they go out. And if you're a modeler of any kind, you might know that this kind of switches into a presence absence framework where we're starting to generate a lot of zeros, because if somebody goes out and reports a list of birds and says, yes, I'm telling you everything I saw and identified, we can make some assumptions about the other birds that you did not see being absent from that location. And so we now have a big pile of zeros to work with as well. But this complete checklist concept is a really important key component of eBird data. And then, of course, the eBird platform has lots of web and mobile tools for birders to use to post photos and audio recordings and keep track of life lists and see where they can go find these birds and where birds have been recently reported, right? This is the thing that drives the success of eBird, is that people go birding and they want to see birds, and eBird is how you find out where they are. Based on this information, you can explore places and see lists of birds and who's been there recently and great photos and all of this. And so it's really what motivates the community to participate. It really activates the public. And it's this technological platform of activating the public that fits into what we call a science to action framework. So we've developed tools like eBird, and other people might be familiar with Merlin sound identification, the Merlin app. By creating that technology, we can activate a public to participate and generate data that powers what I'm going to talk about today, which is this actionable science that can then be used by actors, people who are out in the world. That is not the lab's job. We are not a advocacy organization. We are not managers of land, but we can provide science that guides those actions and actually ends up helping birds in the end. So that's kind of the goal of what we're trying to do there. And for me, as somebody who is a birder, I have been since I was in middle school, and a data scientist, it's a really fun way to participate in this cycle, because I can go out and think about birds from an ecological or geographic perspective and from a birding perspective. And then part of my job is I get to do analysis of that data. So I learn not only about the birds, but about the birding. And that helps inform both my own birding and how I understand how communities are birding. But like I said, it lets us generate tools for birders to use. And then we can analyze that data into applications. And there's feedback loops there, of course, in terms of the applications often come with a lot of feedback, and we can use that to improve our analyses. And ideally, the applications themselves help birds. So it's a very, I hate this word, synergistic situation, but I enjoy where I sit quite a lot. And so I think analyzing data in this way is very rewarding. But a key part of this in the middle here are these binoculars being held by people, and that's actually one of the most challenging parts of generating actionable science, is the variation among what people do, and that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today in terms of analyzing the data. And so you can think of all these different components of human variation when somebody goes out birding to report data to us. There are people that have varying levels of identification and detection skill, right? Experience, how much do they know? How easily can they find hard to find birds or not? And then people may choose to go to different locations, expend a certain amount of effort. They may have very just different behavior in what they do. And this is going to vary across people who may go out to get together, people who may go to the same location. And then it also varies at the scale of continent and country. There are very different birding cultures across the world. For example, in China, there's really focused on cameras and photography, and less. You almost never see anybody carrying binoculars when they're out birding, but they are submitting checklists and observing birds. And people have different levels of patience for counting birds and estimating their counts, and practice with that. And so it's this human variation that, to make eBird useful for conservation science and action, we need to control and essentially model out as best as we can. Because it's not the only process that we want to capture when we're working with eBird data. There's a lot going on in space and time that we want to capture and understand to help birds, right? So at the broadest, most encompassing scales, we want to understand ecologically what's going on with birds, right? What habitats are they associating with? Where are they migrating to and from? And this covers, their entire life cycles at very broad scales. But then there are components of it that are at smaller time scales. And there's a very important component we call availability for detection. And I'll talk about this from a data perspective in more detail, but birds are not always easily seen, right? At this time of year, they're not singing very much, so you may not be able to use Merlin Sound ID to find them. And then if birds are feeding or active, they're easier to find, but if they're quiet and it's windy, not so much. And this adds noise to our data set and is a component we need to control for at a smaller space-time scale. And then people, like I said, are doing things at kind of their mobility, their availability scale. Where are they choosing to go? Are they choosing to only go places where there are lots of birds and they're going to see birds? Or are they choosing to go places where they might find something new? Are they exerting a lot of effort or not? And then in the middle is kind of this detection behavior. What are they doing when they're doing a checklist? Are they paying close attention to certain groups of birds more than others or not? And so these are all the things that we're trying to encompass. And the way we do this is through a species distribution model, and we do it with machine learning. And I'll talk more about the machine learning guts later. But essentially, we use, in ecology, what are called species distribution models. And we're trying to understand, as best as we can approximate an estimate of truth. It's impossible to know where all the birds are all the time, right? You couldn't even perfectly know it if you wanted to, but we can estimate it as best we can, and that's still extremely useful. So I'm going to kind of step through this cartoon of a model that breaks down these kind of key pieces and how we address those different scales that we're working on. The first one of these is that we do take the bird observations, the eBird checklists, and the key part of this before we start analyzing the data is that the eBird platform has a very robust data quality process associated with it. And I'm not going to go into it in detail because it's kind of more about the birding than it is about the data. But there is a quality process where thousands of human reviewers have set up filters for checklists that say how many birds of each species can be reported, or rare species can be reported or not, before details need to be provided, and the human needs to review that list. And this helps prevent erroneous observations from entering the database. And there's thousands of volunteers throughout the world who do this and create these filters, and every eBird checklist goes through a process that's been defined by a human, or even 20% of checklists are looked at directly by somebody to evaluate the quality. So we have this robust process in place. So that's the fundamental part of the bird data, but where it starts to get interesting is when we want to capture that ecological process. And this does two things. This helps us understand what the relationships between birds and the landscape are, but it also helps fill in the gap. So we use environmental variables, mostly remote sensing data from a variety of providers, a lot of it from NASA. But the goal is to fill in the gaps. And so this is an older visualization, but effective. These green dots are the locations of observations of warbler species, common up here, Magnolia warbler. And you can see that there's a very heterogeneous pattern here. It's not very uniform. The really tiny gray dots that kind of create a background of urban pattern are where the species was not seen, where somebody had one of those complete checklists and said, I'm reporting everything I saw, but I didn't see a Magnolia warbler. And so the goal is to go from this very not uniform, incomplete picture to a more complete picture where we're smoothing over and filling in all of the locations so that we can provide a useful picture to people who want to know where the birds are. And so in this visualization, we're estimating the relative abundance, which is a term we use because we can't estimate absolute abundance. We can't say exactly how many birds are there, but white is high and dark orange is low. But we're predicting from this model to all these locations at a high spatial resolution, 3 kilometers, to fill in all those gaps that people didn't get to. And we have a really extensive suite of environmental variables that we use. Like I said, a lot of these come from NASA, but these are things that we've kind of found and gathered over the years. They're almost all open source data products, but things that are understandably about birds, water cover, land use, hydrology, things like elevation and bathymetry, topography, but also human features like roads and nighttime lights, which describe the impact on birds. And also really high temporal resolution, things like enhanced vegetation index, which describes the greenness of the landscape at a monthly resolution. So we're really looking for variables that are global in scale because we're a global project that's trying to model as many species as we can, and that have some temporal resolution to them because the landscape is always changing with birds. So there's a lot more that could be talked about here, but that's the essential kind of starting to build the features for our model that we use to understand what's going on with birds. All right, so stepping down kind of a scale from that really broad part of the ecological is this availability for detection. And so the features that we put in our model for this are information about hourly weather. These come from the Copernicus project. There's ERA5 is a global reanalysis product. It's a 30-kilometer spatial resolution, but hourly detail, and it goes back in time. It basically takes climate models and observational data and backcasts them to create a complete picture of what the weather was like. And so you can see this list of variables here, and just on the right, I'm demonstrating kind of the effect that it has in a model. So wood thrush is a species in the eastern US forest that vocalizes around dawn with this beautiful fluty song. But it doesn't sing when the wind is high, or is not detected when the wind is high, both because the wind could prevent you from doing that, but the bird knows that its song doesn't carry very far when it's windy, and so it doesn't vocalize. And so you can imagine if people are going out at different times of day, different conditions, that you might miss a wood thrush if it's windy. But if we have this feature in our model, we can understand why and not predict to that condition. We can predict to more optimal conditions for the species. Okay, so with availability for detection, we kind of move towards the human component, right? It's impacting whether somebody can detect birds. And then we can focus a little bit more on the behavior element of what people are doing.
Tom, before you jump into that, I just wanted to, we're at about 7:30. I wanted to see if anyone had any questions.
Sure.
So anyone feel free to unmute. If you don't have any questions, we can move on in just a moment. Okay, great. I just wanted to
Right.
make sure, but
Gives me a water break. All right. So checklist calibration index. Way to think about this is, there's a lot of different people with different levels of expertise. So you can think of somebody here starting very young, learning how to use binoculars. You can think of somebody who's been at it a while that's struggling with the technology, maybe doesn't quite understand how to use binoculars, to people who are winning awards for their birding skill and expertise at events like the World Series of Birding in New Jersey. And this range of experience and skill is going to have an impact on whether somebody reports a given species or not. So the way that we handle this is by taking the data from these observers and understanding what we call a species accumulation curve. So what you're seeing here on the x-axis is the length of a checklist in hours. And each dot is a checklist. It's an event where somebody went out birding. And on the y-axis is the number of species that they recorded. And we fit a curve to that species accumulation curve, and it has a given slope. And what we can do is compare that slope to that of someone else. And so here on the right is a different example observer, and you can see that they accumulate species at a much faster rate than the person on the left at a set of locations. And if we stack all these together for everybody in a region and a season, we can see that there's quite a bit of variability in that slope of that curve. But we can use this essentially to create a z-index for everybody's checklist to understand how well they are detecting birds compared to everyone in their area. And then we do that for users and smooth it across users and find out some really interesting things. So on this plot, there's year on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is this checklist calibration index. Think of it like standard deviation: 2 is high, -2 is low. But we find that we can actually see observers, and this is one of my coworkers who, volunteered to be one of these subjects in this example. And he started birding in 2009, and we can see his checklist skill increased, over his first 7 or 8 years of birding there, which is really interesting. And we can also kind of amazingly see the inverse. We can see somebody losing their skill over time. And this is kind of a common thing in birding. There are a number of bird species that vocalize at a really high frequency, up in the 12 to 14 kilohertz range. And older folks, men particularly first, lose their ability to hear at that frequency range, and then lose their ability to detect those birds. And so they're not having lists with as long a list of species on them. And this was somebody in the lab as well who, an older gentleman who knew he wasn't detecting those birds as well, but we could actually quantify that, which was really compelling. So this is how we capture that variability within user and across user in terms of what people are doing out in the field. All right, and then the last component is kind of more what's going on in terms of where people are going and what sites are selecting their effort. And so we have a number of features, effort variables that we put into our model. A lot of these are kind of standard things: year, day, time of day, number of observers. But another example here is this is a white-throated sparrow, which is a bird that vocalizes most often early in the morning, and then tapers off its vocalization rate throughout the day. When we put this feature, time of day, in the model, it does a good job of capturing that pattern and that behavior. And then again, if you go out in the middle of the afternoon, you're not hearing this bird, we can understand that and ideally not predict to that time of day when we want to understand where this bird is. That other component is the site selection. So this map only has two pieces of information on it. One is the outline of the state of New York, and the other are locations of eBird checklists. And so, a couple of things pop out when you look at this map, right? Of course, you see roads, you see Ithaca, New York, you see New York City, but you also see gaps, right? You see places in the Adirondacks and the Catskills and the southern tier that people have hard time getting to, or don't go, or don't want to go. And this creates a bias in our data set in terms of where people are collecting the data, and we do need to control for this. And so we do that with a method we call grid sampling, or case-controlled grid sampling. And so we take this data, and this is imagine just a 30-day sample of the data in the northeastern US. Again, you can really see that strong bias towards urban areas like DC and Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and less data in more rural areas. And what we do is we throw down a 3-kilometer grid on that surface. And what we do is we randomly sample a checklist from each location. When we do this in our species models, we grab one checklist that detected the species and one checklist that did not. But what you get the effect here is that these gray areas where there's that really strong urban bias start to fall away, and we have a little bit more even sampling than we would otherwise. It's not perfect, but it does help. And just to demonstrate that, we ran some models where some machine learning models where we wanted to predict the site selection probability at all locations. So what you're looking at here is basically for a given week, what's the likelihood that somebody went to that location and submitted a checklist. In gray is a really high probability, and dark red is a very low probability. And on the left is the unsampled data. It's all of the data. And you can really see the focus on the bias there towards those urban areas, just as the same if you looked at the data density map on the left. But if you do the grid sampling on the right, we now have a little bit more uniform. There's more signal, more likelihood that a checklist is going to come from an area away from an urban area. Again, not perfect, but it does balance that sample out a little bit. All right, so that's basically the core pieces of our model. Before I kind of tie together some of the scaling and computational challenges that we deal with. I wanted to just dive into what the model it is itself, because this is a data community group, and I thought I could take the opportunity to do that. So I'm going to come back to scaling in a minute, but I'm just going to talk about what our models are. So I've got three parts here. We have data models and predictions. We use a random forest hurdle model using the Ranger R package. And so we just talked about grid sampling. We're going to take that grid sample data. We're going to split it into two pools. We're going to take one pool where we have both detections and non-detections of birds, zeros and ones, and then a pool of only detections. And then we're going to run three separate machine learning models, three separate Ranger models. We're going to run a balanced binary classification forest where we're giving it zeros and ones and asking it to predict zeros and ones. And then a balanced encounter rate. And so when I say encounter rate, what I mean is the probability that somebody is going to encounter that bird when they go out birding. And so this is going to take zeros and ones for whether a bird was there or not, and then give us a probability estimate at a given location. And then with only the detections, only the counts of species that we have, we're going to run a regression forest to estimate how many birds were on a list or at a given location. One thing that's a really interesting help here is that if we take that predicted encounter rate, we also call it an occurrence rate, how often the bird occurs at a given location, we can add that as a feature to our count regression forest, and it really increases the performance of that model. Okay, so now we've got our three models fit with all this eBird data. We want to predict them to that grid that covers the globe. So we're going to make three different predictions. We're going to predict whether a bird was present or absent at a given location. We're going to predict that encounter rate. If it's there, how often is it there? And then we're going to predict a count. And so we're going to then, for our final product, that relative abundance that I talked about, and I'll talk about in a little more detail, is we're going to multiply the encounter rate by the count to get a relative abundance estimate. And then we'll use that presence absence information to mask our final product. So what does that look like? That looks a little bit like this. So dark purple is high relative abundance, large counts of birds. Yellows and oranges are lower counts. Oops, that wasn't supposed to. There we go. Lower counts of birds. And so this is kind of, what this species information looks like for 1 week of the year, kind of covering the US. Gray means zero. And so you can see the bird is concentrated in numerous parts of the US, but the computational challenge and the scaling challenges we have is that the way that the bird relates to habitats in different parts of the country varies depending on where you are. It's not stationary across the space, and it's especially true when you think of how descriptive or not descriptive our remote sensing features are. In the east, the species in March might be using these kind of pastoral, small agricultural grasslands, mixed forest habitats, whereas in California, it might be using large agricultural fields. But the land cover classification data that we're using might call them both the same type of agriculture. And so what we do to do this is to break the world up into lots of smaller pieces and run a lot of independent models. And so I'm going to kind of talk about this method. We call this the spatiotemporal exploratory model. Some papers about this, but this is just a fun example. So let's say on the left that this is a true surface, a simulated true surface of that's describing birds, that we want to capture this with our data. So we're going to simulate some data to sample this true surface, and notice that the simulated data also has bias to where it's collecting it. It's mostly in the bottom right corner where there isn't much spatial pattern to the data. And so the way we were going to capture this as successfully as we can is we're going to divide that space into smaller cells. We call these space-time pixels, or stixels, not the best name, but it's what they're called in the paper. And we're going to fit models with just data from one piece of this at a time. And then we're going to fit that model that I just described and predict it. And so we're going to do this for all of those different cells. And you can see that individually, each cell is maybe not great at predicting what's going on. It's doing better in the bottom. It's got more data, the pattern's less interesting, but the top left is not good. And so the way that we get a good surface out of this is to do a resampling strategy. We're going to divide again. We're going to shift the grid around. We're going to predict again. And we're going to keep doing this. And by doing this in an ensemble method and summarizing across that kind of standard grid on the left, we'll eventually be able to extract the pattern. And so here, if we average over 3 folds, it doesn't look very good, right? It's kind of rough and coarse, and we're missing data. If we do it 5 times, we're getting better, 10 times, and finally at 100 times, we're getting close to capturing that signal as best as we can. So that's essentially what's going on. And if we scale this out to the globe, we take it one step further, and we do this adaptively, where we are partitioning the globe into these grid cells, and we're doing it based on data density. So you can see large cells in Africa and Russia, but in the US, where we have more data, we can subdivide and fit models in smaller regions with higher data density. All right, so what does this look like if you actually do this? So I'm going to show an example here for indigo bunting, which is a songbird in the east. This is during its breeding season when it's very active in June. What you're seeing here is each square is predicting the estimated relative abundance for that single week at all locations and thinks the bird is there. So each cell that is blinking on is the independent predictions from a single model fit and predict. And you can see that there's a lot of like hard boundaries there, right? There's like sharp edges. There's kind of different intercepts in terms of what they're predicting, and where some places are predicting, that the bird is in the water, which it's definitely not. And so this is one iteration. We're going to do this 100 times to smooth this out. And so that's what this next example is. And this will replay a couple times. But basically, we're going to do this 100 times, and it's cumulatively averaging them together. Towards the end of the animation, you can see it still predicting towards the edge, and then at the very end, it does one final masking. It should automatically restart here in a second. But early on, yes, in the animation, you can see it's still trying to figure out what those patterns are, and then it's filling in better in those rarer data density areas where the species is less common. But this is a really computationally intensive thing, but it gives us the robustness of our estimates. It also lets us generate uncertainty because we're doing an ensemble of, each location on this map has at least 100 predictions, 100 estimates, and it also lets us understand the model performance as well. So this leads us to what our actionable science product is, and if you go to our website, these are what you find. And that's these weekly 3-kilometer estimates of relative abundance that show these animations, through these animations, the migrations of these species across space and time. So the spatial resolution here is 3 kilometers. We're estimating it every week. And that relative abundance goes from pale yellow orange up to purple, showing the how many birds there are at each of those locations. Now, if we do this, if we wanted to, go the next step with our relative abundance, this is a great snapshot of where the birds are in 2022. But it's just a single year estimate. There's no information about trends or what's happening. And so that's the newest thing that we've been working on, our latest, greatest development. We just had a methods paper published about this, so I'll talk about it just for a few minutes. And that's that there are really some different issues associated when you're trying to understand the trends over time in where birds are. We talk about this as a confounding situation, and so you can think about a lot of things that might be happening that aren't happening with birds that could be impacting our ability to measure that with data and analysis. And so one of the primary ones is checklist data density. So on the left here, each map panel shows the density of checklists, eBird checklists that we're getting by year, and the program, wasn't really very strong in 2007, but over time, more and more people participated. And so we're filling in data over time in places there wasn't data before. And you can imagine that this has an impact on our ability to measure the signal of what's happening with birds. Similarly, what people are doing over time is changing. So this density plot shows what time of day people went out through the years. And so the reds and yellows and greens on the left are from the early years of the program, and the dark blues and purples are from later years. In the early years, it was mostly like, hardcore bird nuts going out who were willing to tolerate the bad software. And so they went out first thing in the morning when it's ideal to go birding. But as the program grew and more people participated, people went out at times that were convenient, and so they kind of smoothed out to a more human time frame, but with still some preference for the morning when birds are more active. And so this kind of shift in what people are doing over time can impact our ability to measure trends. And so do new technologies that help people learn. So you can imagine that Merlin Sound ID is helping people detect birds in a way they never were able to before. And so having those tools come online impacts what's happening with the birds. And we don't want to measure that false signal. We want to know what's really happening with the birds. So I'm not going to go into this in a lot of depth because it does get pretty complicated, but essentially we have a process very similar to the one that I've described with the relative abundance estimates before, but we use this method called double machine learning. There's a paper by co-author Daniel Fink in Methods in Ecology and Evolution. This is a type of causal learning. We use the GRF-R package, causal machine learning, causal forests. And the important parts here is that it does two things. It controls for that confounding in the observation process. And I'll talk about that just a little bit more, but it also captures the spatial variation with the habitat features, which is something new for in our field. A lot of the description about trends of birds is at very broad scales, like states or countries. And so the double machine learning part is that before you run a model to estimate where and how many birds there are and how they're changing through time, is that you have a propensity model that tries to predict what year the data was from, and can use that in the downstream models to control for that change through time. It's more complicated than that, but that's essentially what's going on. We can also validate it with simulations, and this is kind of a fun thing, is that we generate a bunch of synthetic data. And the more I've been around this and done this, I think like everybody should do this when you're running a model, because it can really help you understand how your model is performing. But essentially on the right, we simulate a trend. And so dark red is a decrease, dark blue is an increase. We've given it a spatial pattern based on land cover features. And we're simulating data, eBird data, with a known trend component to it. And then we send that simulated data through our model and ask the model to estimate it. And that's what you see on the left. And you see that by and large, the model did a pretty good job. It didn't get the magnitude completely right in the center part of the country, but it got the direction negative right. And this really helps us understand that, our trend estimates are robust for a given species, and we can use that as kind of a data quality filter. But the more I've been in this field, the more I think that if you're writing models to estimate things, you should write simulations to see how they're behaving. And so our trend estimates here, this is an example for that other species, the species I've been talking about, indigo bunting. What you're seeing here, as opposed to the color showing relative abundance, is that the size of the dot represents the relative abundance for the species in the middle of a time range here, 2012 through 2022. The color of the dot is red if it's decrease, blue if it's increase. The lighter the color, the shade, the less the trend. And then if it's white, that means that the confidence interval of the trend crosses zero, and we don't know which direction that trend was going. But this has been an extremely valuable tool, and at this kind of spatial resolution, which may seem coarse for some people in remote sensing, but at 27-kilometer resolution provides a level of detail for analyzing bird trends that hasn't been available yet. So I am getting close to the end, but I did just want to touch briefly on the fact that we have worked with partners to validate these data products as well. And this is a really fun example, partnering in the Western US with the US Fish and Wildlife Service on eagles. So here's a golden eagle. We've also done this with bald eagles. But essentially, the Fish and Wildlife Service runs these really expensive aerial surveys from planes that are also a little bit dangerous to count eagles to monitor the populations in the West. And this plot on the right shows both those aerial survey data as dot and whisker plots, but then a scaled eBird approach in a green bar and line. And you can see that the eBird estimates of eagles matches quite well with the Fish and Wildlife Service. But the key point here is that the Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't able to afford to run these for a number of years, and eventually COVID prevented it as well. And the eBird data, which had been mapped well with previous estimates, could fill in for it. And so it's been a really exciting partnership to be able to provide a product like this directly to somebody who's monitoring and managing the eagles. We also do this with bald eagles in the US with the Fish and Wildlife Service, providing a data layer that they can use to permit wind energy, keeping them away from high risk eagle locations and focusing on lower risk eagle locations. And so, if you're interested in what we're up to, if you go to ebird.org, there's a science tab in the top right, and you can check out our stuff. We do make all of our data products available for access, either directly clicking on them on the website and getting those spatial data products, or we have an R package to programmatically access the data. It's been really interesting looking at how much data goes this way. In the past 2 years, we've had about 250,000 downloads directly from the website, but 2 million from the R package. So yay for R and being able to do it programmatically, which is really cool. But yeah, I think at that point, just like to say thanks for listening to what I have to say, and I hope you found it useful.
Thank you so much, Tom. Um, so I have a lot of questions, but I always want to defer to the other people in the audience first, because like I said earlier, this is a very, this can be a very selfish uh, program where we get people that we want to hear talk. So does anyone else have any other questions for Tom around all of the content that he just went over that was so impressive?
Yeah, no question to I don't know. I get a lot of people that are like, I have a stupid question. There's no stupid questions. So I've never had anybody ask me a stupid question.
We are in the industry of finding answers to stupid questions. So yeah, there are no stupid questions. Okay, I will kick us off then.
Oh, Amanda, we might have had one. EK, I don't know. I saw you
Yeah.
unmute, so I don't know.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I know that if that Cornell does the Project Feeder Watch every year, I imagine you get an influx of data at that time. And if I am also correct in assuming that you update some of these models, periodically when you get a whole bunch of new data, it seems like you would have to be producing these and getting them out really quickly. Have you gotten a process just down pat to be able to do that? Otherwise, how are you pulling it off logistically to do so much work?
That's a great question. We have a pretty robust team of data engineers. We have about 10 people just focused on data engineering, data development, visualization. And then that doesn't even include the front end of the web team. We do generate these products on a yearly basis. We might actually switch to an every other year cycle. But yeah, eBird data is growing at about 20% per year. So there's always a big pool of new data to use. And then we have Sean Lagaki and Miles Stokowski on our team. I got to add Miles to the slide. Basically are dedicated to running this high performance computing workflow, mostly in Python and R. We're very lucky. We have been given computing credits on the NSF Access supercomputing network, which actually, it's really easy for pretty much anybody to get credits there if you need computing power. But we get a large volume of credits every year, and then rerun these analyses with the updated data, and almost always with updated methods and features each year, and then make them available. So it's a large part of what our team focuses on each year.
Cool, thank you.
Yep.
Anyone else with questions? Okay, so I have a question that centers around kind of you talked a little bit around like validity with your ability to work with different federal programs, including the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I wanted to go back to one of your first slides, the checklists that you collect. Do you have a way of understanding, and you kind of got into it with the experience levels based on number of birds and hours that you showed, but is there a way of validating the data that someone brings in? So if you you might have someone who's very young, maybe not super experienced, so they're reporting, they think they see 10 birds a minute or something, they have a high count and they're
Yeah.
like, there's bird everywhere. But they're not doing it over a long period of time, or maybe they are doing it over a long period of time, but the rate is not as effective. How do you check for that kind of validation and govern the quality of that data?
Yeah, so we have actually, if you just give me a second, I will spin up a different presentation because I've got a great slide about it. Just one second. Here it is. Okay. Okay, so yeah, we have this network of 2,000 volunteers that review the data, and they set up these filters that are automated. And so this is what a filter looks like. It's for an example in Brazil, but basically this is one of our checklists on the right. And two things that happen if you report either a rare bird or a high count of a bird is that it gets flagged in our app, so to speak, and these little icons pop up and say, please add comments. And there's people that are defining these filters. And so, if we're at a location in the summer, this filter here for the species short-tailed nighthawk says that there shouldn't be any there right now. 0 birds are allowed. And then on this checklist, somebody has said they saw one. And so at that point, the users, notify this is rare. You please add some comments and details. Nowadays, with the ubiquity of photography, we almost always expect a photo to be uploaded. And then that can be identified in multiple ways. Either the reviewer looks at the photo and decides whether it's actually the species or it is, or Merlin Photo ID can do that now. And then the other thing that is happening is that the filters say how many of an individual are allowed. And so in this case, the species scissor-tailed nightjar would 9 can be on the checklist without it having to be validated. But if you go over that, it says, hey, this is a high count for this date and location. Can you tell us some more about how you counted that number of species? And so this is our like front end first pass on this. And then if you put in all those comments and do a good job and people look at it and say, hey, yeah, this person, cared about what they were doing and took the time, then the checklist is marked as public and is publicly displayed in the database. We also do, as part of our checklist calibration index, filter out some data where there's a very erroneous signal. That index can go well beyond a z-score of -2 to 2, and then we say, whoa, something's going on here. Maybe this isn't good data to trust.
Makes sense. It's almost like a combination of qualitative metrics and Reddit up, down, upvote, downvote, like history. If you're a credible user, then you're more likely to be believed. I guess last question for me, unless anyone else has questions, because we're getting close to time. Insofar as those checklists, the completeness of those checklists, do you find that there are discrepancies in the self-reporting of that, where the expectation might have been that they saw more birds, but they maybe, and I think this gets into the analyses you were doing around as someone gets older, they maybe don't hear as many birds, or their awareness of the scenario is not necessarily as high as it used to be.
Right. Yeah, we definitely do see that, and it's a bit tricky because sometimes we use a machine learning model. Sometimes the features do a good job of like describing a location that, basically what we're doing is modeling species richness, how many species are expected at a location, and then comparing it to what somebody reported. And sometimes it's very easy to see that, okay, everybody who goes to this location reports 40 species, but this person only reported 20. And so we can say, okay, so maybe that person isn't as good at detecting. And when we use their data in our models, we can like downweight those detections a little bit. And more importantly is the non-detection, right? That zero is like, if somebody who's always seeing less birds than everyone else says, I didn't see a bird, can't really trust that zero, that non-detection, so to speak, as well. And it's really all in the model. The model basically kind of downweights that. And then we choose to predict to somebody who is often detecting a lot of species and is kind of good at detecting a large number of birds, if that makes sense.
It does. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. This was an awesome presentation. We hope to maybe have some of your colleagues or you join us again in the future. Thank you everyone for joining. Again, we are working towards our new year planning session. So if you have things that you're interested in learning about next year, if you have ideas around career fairs, having recruiters come in to adjust your resumes or assess your resumes, different things like that, please let us know. And Open Data Day is November 2nd, so please come and join us there. I will get back to those of you in the chat that asked about recordings for that once I hear back from the organizer. So thank you so much for your questions, and I'll be sure to reach out. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Have a good
you.
night.